Welcome back to another episode on Ladies First, Not Really. This week we're highlighting a 255-year-old foundational member of Fredericksburg, the Chimneys. Located at 623 Caroline Street, a gorgeous Georgian architecture stands confident as it watches over the city. With its stone foundation, weatherboard siding, 6/6 and 9/9 window panes, the kitchen that was originally a separate structure until around 1908, and its unusually large chimneys that gave the structure its name. The front of the house faces Caroline Street today, but the front was originally on the other side facing the Rappahannock River. The walls of this home holds the memories of those who lived and visited here. If only the walls could talk, oh, the stories they would tell of laughter, tears, celebrations, fear, happiness, and loss. The windows are its eyes and are witness to all that occurs outside. For over 2 centuries, it has watched the Rappahannock River's current and the wooden merchant ships come into port as the economy boomed. As the desire for American independence grew, it watched neighbors turn against each other as the division between independence and continued English rule deepened. It met future American presidents when they were just attorneys. Right before Christmas in 1862, it once again witnessed American division during the Battle of Fredericksburg. From December 11th through the 15th, destruction ensued through the city as the Union and Confederate forces fought for control. Men running through the streets, bullets and cannonballs flying through the air, women and children hiding in their cellars for protection as their homes were ransacked, destroyed, and burned above them. Wounded men laid all over the streets, and homes were used as makeshift hospitals. The Chimneys was no exception. Even though it survived destruction during the battle, its rooms would have been swapped from restful living quarters to makeshift operating rooms. At less than 1 century old, these windows and walls had so much to tell. But life moves on, and the Chimneys saw healing and rebuilding over the next several decades. The Chimneys has had multiple owners over its lifetime, but its history continued to be embraced and cherished. Its current owners, Billiken Smokehouse, is no exception. Its history is continuing to be preserved and cherished today. All right, let's dive into its history, owners, and the love story of a future American president and his future wife. You know, it's funny when I mentioned the Chimneys, most people were like, the what? Like, the Chimneys, the big white house, downtown Fredericksburg. The big white house that has the huge chimneys. Oh, I think I know where that is. That's generally the response I get because most people don't know about this house. They don't even know where it is. And I'm like, it's on Caroline Street. Yeah, I think I know what you're talking about. No, they don't. They have no idea what I'm talking about. So, we are covering the Chimneys in this episode because it's got an amazing story. Let's walk down somebody's memory lane, because none of us were around, and cover the Chimneys. So next time that you go strolling through downtown Fredericksburg, maybe getting a coffee, walking the dog, and you walk down Caroline Street, you're going to look and be like, man, I know the history of that house. Did you know it was called the Chimneys? And then someone else is going to be like, the what? And you're going to be like, yeah, the Chimneys. Where? The White House with the huge chimneys. That's what you're going to say after this episode. The first record of the property being sold was in 1740 to Henry and John Willis. The property changed hands many times between 1740 and 1771 when Charles Yates, a merchant in Fredericksburg, sold it to John Glassell, who was also a merchant. Charles died in 1809 and is buried in the Fredericksburg Masonic Cemetery next to the James Monroe Museum on Charles Street. John most likely built the house, even though there isn't recorded documentation if the structure existed when he purchased it from Charles or if he built it himself. John was born in Galloway, Scotland in 1738 and presumably moved to Fredericksburg around 1771. He owned several tracts of land in Fredericksburg and was a successful merchant. As the cry for independence became increasingly louder across the colonies, John, who was a British loyalist, decided to move back to Scotland. So in 1780, he transferred all his property to his brother Andrew, who was residing in Culpeper. He died in 1806 and never returned to Fredericksburg. Now, Andrew did not live at the Chimneys, and he died in 1814. Daniel Grinnan was listed as his power of attorney and oversaw the sale to John Mundell in 1814. Mundell owned it for approximately 18 months. Now, in a twist of events, Daniel Grinnan married Andrew Glassell's daughter, Helen B. Glassell, in 1850, and Mundell deeded the house to Daniel and his new wife on February 1st, 1815. Daniel had moved to Fredericksburg from Culpeper at a young age and joined the local Somerville and Mitchell merchants in town. He was known for his untiring industry and integrity. He eventually became a merchant partner at the firm Murray, Grinnan, and Mundell and owned a lot of property in Fredericksburg. And he died on March 25, 1830, and is also buried in the Masonic Cemetery. The next owner was Claiborne Wigglesworth, who was another merchant in Fredericksburg, and he bought the house in 1818 from Grinnan. Claiborne owned lots of property, but found himself in a financial situation, which resulted in the home being put up for auction. Fayette Johnston won the bid and bought it for $1,300, and Fayette owned it over 12 years. Now, in 1843, Dr. Brodie Herndon, a local physician, bought the house. He lived there for 29 years and ran his medical practice from his office in the basement and eventually put in a side entrance on the main floor and continued to operate from there. In 1935, it was noted by the current resident, which was Ralph Buffington, that his saddlebags were still in the room that was his office. He was the brother of Captain William Herndon, who was known for exploring the Amazon River in 1851. And Captain Herndon died in a hurricane on the SS Central America off the Cape Hatteras in 1857. Now, Captain Herndon's daughter was named Ellen Lewis Herndon, also known as Nell, and she was Brodie's niece. She spent a good portion of her childhood at the Chimneys due to her birth home being in Culpeper and her relations with the Herndon family. She was a beautiful woman, a talented singer, and well known in town. A young lawyer named Charles A. Chester came to Fredericksburg and fell in love with her. It was reported that a good portion of the courting had been done on the steps of the old stairs in the main hall. It was also reported by locals that they were engaged in the large northern front room downstairs and finalized a wedding in New York in 1859. Charles Chester would go on to become the 21st president, but tragically, Ellen would not live to see her husband inaugurated. In 1872, Charles A. Shepard owned the property. Charles owned a dry goods business in New York, and after the Civil War, he came to Fredericksburg and owned a hardware store on Caroline Street. He had two daughters that had made the house a home. In 1882, William St. John, his wife Hannah Benedict, and their three daughters moved here from New Canaan, Connecticut. Interestingly, one daughter, Rosalie, married Charles Herndon, son of Brodie Herndon, and St. John owned it until 1908. It was a very small town. The next owner was Mary Norris, who bought the property in 1908 after the death of her husband, Hannon E. Norris, in 1907. Now, they operated a high-end jewelry store called Norris Jewelry that was to the right of the house at 619 Caroline Street. When Hannon died, Mary remarried Ralph Buffington. He was a doctor of optometry and operated his practice out of the jewelry store until 1945. Ralph sold the property to the historic Fredericksburg Foundation, FFI, in 1966, and it eventually became their headquarters and a museum in 1975. In 1982, the HFFI sold it to William J. Vacos, who converted it into a restaurant called the Chimneys Public House. The two-story porches on the kitchen structure were added at this time and are still intact. The Chimneys has been many different restaurants since 1982 and is currently owned by Billiken Smokehouse, who embraces its 18th century history and gorgeous architecture. Now, there have been many reports of the Chimneys being haunted. Reports specifically note a woman's spirit that continues to occupy the house. Many thought it was Joanna Glassell, daughter of John. However, Joanna was born in 1796, and that was years after John had moved back to Scotland, so it's likely not her. The story of the haunting has continued for almost a century and is a special addition to the chimney story. The earliest reporting comes from the shepherds' time as occupants. They reported to Mrs. St. John when she purchased the house in 1882 of hearing a woman's footsteps as early as 1872. But they had gotten used to it. Mrs. St. John had her own experiences with hearing footsteps at night. And when Mary Norris bought the house, St. John told her about the ghost and relayed the shepherds and her own experiences hearing it pacing the house at night. Now, when interviewed by the WPA surveyor in 1937, the Buffingtons recalled very specific activity they had witnessed. They all heard the footsteps of a woman at night and during the day from time to time. The sounds came from the guest room along with the mechanical sounds of a doorknob turning. The Buffington's daughter, Sally Norris, recalled directly a time she felt the ghost pat her on the shoulder. She couldn't see her, but she knew she was present. As with the previous owners, the ghost existed as a silent member of the family. There's also stories of a young boy who also is in the house. And the evidence of ghosts is still reported today over 150 years later. It's a great addition to the chimney story. If you are looking to connect to your ancestry or own a historic property and have always wondered its history, or maybe you know the history and would like it to be highlighted on one of our podcasts, please visit us at dogwoodandironresearch.com.